Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we're reading from Kidnapped, chapters 17 and 18. Chapter 17, The Death of the Red Fox. The next day, Mr. Henderland found for me a man who had a boat of his own and was to cross the Linney Loch that afternoon into Appin fishing. Him he prevailed on to take me, for he was one of his flock, and in this way I saved a long day's travel and the price of the 2 public ferries I must otherwise have passed. It was near noon before we set out, a dark day with clouds and the sun shining upon little patches. The sea was here very deep and still, and had scarce a wave upon it, so that I must put the water to my lips before I could believe it to be truly salt. The mountains on either side were high, rough, and barren, very black and gloomy in the shadow of the clouds, but all silver-laced with little watercourses where the sun shone upon them. It seemed a hard country, this of Appin, for people to care as much about as Alan did. But there was but one thing to mention. A little after we had started, the sun shone upon a little moving clump of scarlet close in along the waterside to the north. It was much of the same red as soldiers' coats. Every now and then, too, there came little sparks and lightnings, as though the sun had struck upon bright steel. I asked my boatman what it should be, and he answered he supposed it was some of the red soldiers coming from Fort William into Appin against the poor tenantry of the country. Well, it was a sad sight to me, and whether it was because of my thoughts of Alan, or from something prophetic in my bosom, although this was but the second time I had seen King George's troops, I had no good will to them. At last we came so near the point of land at the entering in of Loch Leven that I begged to be set on shore. My boatman, who was an honest fellow and mindful of his promise to the catechist, would fain have carried me on to Ballachulish, but as this was to take me farther from my secret destination, I insisted, and was set on shore at last under the wood of Lettermore, or Lettervore, for I have heard it both ways, in Alan's country of Appin. There was a wood of birches growing on a steep, craggy side of a mountain that overhung the loch. It had many openings and ferny houghs, and a road or bridle track ran north and south through the midst of it, by the edge of which, where there was a spring, I sat down to eat some oat bread of Mr. Henderland's, and think upon my situation. Here I was, not only troubled by a cloud of stinging midges, but far more by the doubts of my mind. What I ought to do, why I was going to join myself with an outlaw and a would-be murderer like Alan, whether I should not be acting more like a man of sense to tramp back to the south country direct, by my own guidance and at my own charges, and what Mr. Campbell or even Mr. Henderland would think of me if they should ever learn my folly and presumption. These were the doubts that now began to come in on me stronger than ever. As I was so sitting and thinking, a sound of men and horses came to me through the wood, and presently after, at a turning of the road, I saw 4 travelers come into view. The way was in this part so rough and narrow that they came single and led their horses by the reins. The first was a great red-headed gentleman of an imperious and flushed face, who carried his hat in his hand and fanned himself, for he was in a breathing heat. The second, by his decent black garb and white wig, I correctly took to be a lawyer. The third was a servant, and wore some part of his clothes in tartan, which showed that his master was of a Highland family, and either an outlaw, or else in singular good odor with the government, since the wearing of tartan was against the act. If I had been better versed in these things, I would have known the tartan to be of the Argyle or Campbell colors. This servant had a good-sized portmanteau strapped on his horse, and a net of lemons to brew punch with, hanging at the saddle-bow, as was often enough the custom with luxurious travelers in that part of the country. As for the fourth, who brought up the tale, I had seen his like before, and knew him at once to be a sheriff's officer. I had no sooner seen these people coming than I made up my mind, for no reason that I can tell, to go through with my adventure, and when the first came alongside of me, I rose up from the bracken and asked him the way to Okarn. He stopped and looked at me, as I thought, a little oddly, and then turning to the lawyer, "Mungo," said he, "there's many a man would think this more of a warning than 2 pyets. Here am I on my road to Durrer on the job you ken, and here is a young lad starts up out of the bracken and speers if I am on the way to Okarn." "Glenure," said the other, "this is an ill subject for jesting." These 2 had now drawn close and were gazing at me, while the 2 followers had halted about a stone cast in the rear. And what seek ye in Okarn? Said Colin Roy Campbell of Glenure. Him they called the Red Fox, for he it was that I had stopped. The man that lives there, said I. James of the Glens, says Glenure musingly, and then to the lawyer, is he gathering his people, think ye? Anyway, says the lawyer, we shall do better to bide where we are and let the soldiers rally us. If you were concerned for me, said I am neither of his people nor yours, but an honest subject of King George, owing no man and fearing no man. Why, very well said, replies the factor, but if I may make so bold as to ask, what does this honest man so far from his country? And why does he come seeking the brother of Ardshiel? I have power here, I must tell you. I am king's factor upon several of these estates, and have 12 files of soldiers at my back. I have heard a waif word in the country, said I, a little nettled, that you were a hard man to drive. He still kept looking at me as if in doubt. Well, said he at last, your tongue is bold, but I am no unfriend to plainness. If ye had asked me the way to the door of James Stewart on any other day but this, I would have set you right and bidden ye Godspeed. But today, Mungo? And he turned again to look at the lawyer. But just as he turned, there came the shot of a firelock from higher up the hill, and with the very sound of it, Glenure fell upon the road. Oh, I am dead, he cried, several times over. The lawyer had caught him up and held him in his arms, the servant standing over and clasping his hands. And now the wounded man looked from one to another with scared eyes, and there was a change in his voice that went to the heart. Take care of yourself, said he. I am dead. He tried to open his clothes as if to look for the wound, but his fingers slipped on the buttons. With that he gave a great sigh, his head rolled on his shoulder, and he passed away. The lawyer never said a word, but his face was as sharp as a pen and as white as the dead man's. The servant broke out into a great noise of crying and weeping like a child, and I, on my side, stood staring at them in a kind of horror. The sheriff's officer had run back at the first sound of the shot, to hasten the coming of the soldiers. At last the lawyer laid down the dead man in his blood upon the road and got to his own feet with a kind of stagger. I believe it was his movement that brought me to my senses, for he had no sooner done so than I began to scramble up the hill, crying out, "The murderer! The murderer!" So little a time had elapsed that when I got to the top of the first steepness and could see some part of the open mountain, the murderer was still moving away at no great distance. He was a big man, in a black coat with metal buttons, and carried a long fowling piece. "Here," I cried, "I see him." At that the murderer gave a little quick look over his shoulder and began to run. The next moment he was lost in a fringe of birches. Then he came out again on the upper side, where I could see him climbing like a jackanapes, for that part was again very steep, and then he dipped behind his shoulder, and I saw him no more. All this time I had been running on my side and had got a good way up when a voice cried upon me to stand. I was at the edge of the upper wood, and so now when I halted and looked back, I saw all the open part of the hill below me. The lawyer and the sheriff's officer were standing just above the road, crying and waving on me to come back, and on their left the redcoats, musket in hand, were beginning to struggle singly out of the lower wood. "Why should I come back?" I cried. "Come you on." £10 if you take that lad," cried the lawyer. "He's an accomplice. He was posted here to hold us in talk." At that word, which I could hear quite plainly, though it was to the soldiers and not to me that he was crying it, my heart came in my mouth with quite a new kind of terror. Indeed, it is one thing to stand the danger of your life, and quite another to run the peril of both life and character. The thing, besides, had come so suddenly, like thunder out of a clear sky, that I was all amazed and helpless. The soldiers began to spread, some of them to run, and others to put up their pieces and cover me, and still I stood. "Jouk in here among the trees," said a voice close by. Indeed, I scarce knew what I was doing, but I obeyed. And as I did so, I heard the firelocks bang and the balls whistle in the birches. Just inside the shelter of the trees, I found Alan Breck standing with a fishing rod. He gave me no salutation. Indeed, it was no time for civilities. Only, "Come," says he, and set off running along the side of the mountain toward Balashulish, and I, like a sheep, to follow him. Now we ran among the birches, now stooping behind low humps upon the mountainside, now crawling on all fours among the heather. The pace was deadly. My heart seemed bursting against my ribs, and I had neither time to think nor breath to speak with. Only I remember seeing with wonder that Allen every now and then would straighten himself to his full height and look back, and every time he did so, there came a great far-away cheering and crying of the soldiers. Quarter of an hour later, Allen stopped, clapped down flat in the heather, and turned to me. "Now," said he, "it's earnest. Do as I do for your life." And at the same speed, but now with infinitely more precaution, we traced back again across the mountainside by the same way that we had come, only perhaps higher, till at last Allen threw himself down in the upper wood of Lettermore, where I had found him at the first, and lay with his face in the bracken, panting like a dog. My own sides so ached, my head so swam, my tongue so hung out of my mouth with heat and dryness, that I lay beside him like one dead. Chapter 18. I Talk with Allen in the Wood of Lettermore. Allen was the first to come round. He rose, went to the border of the wood, peered out a little, and then returned and sat down. "Well," said he, "yon was a hot burst, David." I said nothing, nor so much as lifted my face. I had seen murder, and a great, ruddy, jovial gentleman struck out of life in a moment. The pity of that sight was still sore within me, and yet that was but a part of my concern. Here was murder done upon the man Allen hated. Here was Allen skulking in the trees and running from the troops. And whether his was the hand that fired, or only the head that ordered, signified but little. By my way of it, my only friend in that wild country was blood guilty in the first degree. I held him in horror. I could not look upon his face. I would rather have lain alone in the rain on my cold isle than in that warm wood beside a murderer. "Are you still wearied?" he asked again. "No," said I, still with my face in the bracken. "No, I am not wearied now, and I can speak. You and me must twine," I said. "I liked you very well, Allen, but your ways are not mine, and they're not God's, and the short and the long of it is just that we must twine." "I will hardly twine from you, David, without some kind of reason for the same," said Allen, mighty gravely. "If you can anything against my reputation, it's the least thing that ye should do, for old acquaintance' sake, to let me hear the name of it. And if ye have only taken a distaste to my society, it will be proper for me to judge if I'm insulted." "Allen," said I, "what is the sense of this? Ye can very well yon Campbell man lies in his blood upon the road." He was silent for a little. Then says he, "Did ever ye hear tell of the story of the man and the good people?" by which he meant the fairies. "No," said I, "nor do I want to hear it." "With your permission, Mr. Balfour, I will tell it you, whatever," says Allen. "The man, ye should ken, was cast upon a rock in the sea, where it appears the good people were in use to come and rest as they went through to Ireland. The name of this rock is called the Skerryvore, and it's not far from where we suffered shipwreck. Well, it seems the man cried so sore, if he could just see his little bairn before he died, that at last the king of the good people took pity upon him, and sent one flying that brought back the bairn in a poke and laid it down beside the man where he lay sleeping. So when the man woke, there was a poke beside him, and something into the inside of it that moved. Well, it seems he was one of these gentry that think I the worst of things, and for greater security he stuck his dirk throughout that poke before he opened it, and there was his bairn dead. I am thinking to myself, Mr. Balfour, that you and the man are very much alike." "Do you mean you had no hand in it?" cried I, sitting up. "I will tell you first of all, Mr. Balfour of Shaw's, as one friend to another," said Allen, "that if I were going to kill a gentleman, it would not be in my own country to bring trouble on my clan, and I would not go wanting sword and gun, and with a long fishing rod upon my back." "Well," said I, "that's true. And now," continued Allen, taking out his dirk and laying his hand upon it in a certain manner, "I swear upon the holy iron I had neither art nor part, act nor thought in it." "I thank God for that," cried I, and offered him my hand. He did not appear to see it. "And here is a great deal of work about a Campbell," said he. "They are not so scarce that I can. At least," said I, "you cannot justly blame me, for you know very well what you told me in the brig. But the temptation and the act are different. I thank God again for that. We may all be tempted, but to take a life in cold blood, Allen," and I could say no more for the moment. "And do you know who did it?" I added. "Do you know that man in the black coat?" "I have no clear mind about his coat," said Allen cunningly, "but it sticks in my head that it was blue." Blue or black, did you know him? Said I. I couldn't just consciously swear to him, says Alan. He got very close by me, to be sure, but it's a strange thing that I should just have been tying my brogues. Can you swear that you don't know him, Alan? I cried, half angered, half in a mind to laugh at his evasions. No yet, says he, but I've a grand memory for forgetting, David. Yet there was one thing I saw clearly, said I, and that was that you exposed yourself and me to draw the soldiers. It's very likely, said Alan, and so would any gentleman. You and me were innocent of that transaction. The better reason, since we were falsely suspected, that we should get clear, I cried. The innocent should surely come before the guilty. Why, David, said he, the innocent have I a chance to get assoiled in court, but for the lad that shot the bullet, I think the best place for him will be the heather. Them that havena dipped their hands in any little difficulty should be very mindful of the case of them that have, and that is the good Christianity. For if it was the other way round about, and the lad whom I couldn't just clearly see had been in our shoes, and we in his, as might very well have been, I think we would be a good deal obliged to him ourselves if he would draw the soldiers. When it came to this, I gave Alan up. But he looked so innocent all the time, and was in such clear good faith in what he said, and so ready to sacrifice himself for what he deemed his duty, that my mouth was closed. Mr. Henderland's words came back to me, that we ourselves might take a lesson by these wild Highlanders. Well, here I had taken mine. Alan's morals were all tail first, but he was ready to give his life for them, such as they were. Alan, said I, I'll not say it's the good Christianity as I understand it, but it's good enough, and here I offer you my hand for the second time. Whereupon he gave me both of his, saying surely I had cast a spell upon him, for he could forgive me anything. Then he grew very grave, and said we had not much time to throw away, but must both flee that country. He, because he was a deserter, and the whole of Appin would now be searched like a chamber, and every one obliged to give a good account of himself, and I, because I was certainly involved in the murder. Oh, says I, willing to give him a little lesson, I have no fear of the justice of my country. As if this was your country, said he, or as if you would be tried here in a country of Stuarts. It's all Scotland, said I. Man, I whiles wonder at ye, said Alan. This is a Campbell that's been killed. Well, it'll be tried in Inverara, the Campbell's head place, with 15 Campbells in the jury box, and the biggest Campbell of all, and that's the Duke, sitting cocking on the bench. Justice, David? The same justice by all the world as Glenure found a while ago at the roadside. This frightened me a little, I confess, and would have frightened me more if I had known how nearly exact were Alan's predictions. Indeed, it was but in one point that he exaggerated, there being but 11 Campbells on the jury, though as the other 4 were equally in the Duke's dependence, it mattered less than might appear. Still, I cried out that he was unjust to the Duke of Argyle, who, for all he was a Whig, was yet a wise and honest nobleman. Hoot, said Alan, the man's a Whig, no doubt, but I would never deny he was a good chieftain to his clan. And what would the clan think if there was a Campbell shot, and nobody hanged, and their own chief the Justice General? But I have often observed, says Alan, that you low country bodies have no clear idea of what's right and wrong. At this I did at last laugh out aloud, when to my surprise Alan joined in and laughed as merrily as myself. Nah, said he, we're in the Highlands, David, and when I tell you to run, take my word and run. No doubt it's a hard thing to skulk and starve in the heather, but it's harder yet to lie shackled in a redcoat prison. I asked him whither we should flee, and as he told me to the lowlands, I was little better inclined to go with him, for indeed I was growing impatient to get back and have the upper hand of my uncle. Besides, Alan made so sure there would be no questions of justice in the matter that I began to be afraid he might be right. Of all deaths, I would truly like least to die by the gallows, and the picture of that uncanny instrument came into my head with extraordinary clearness, as I had once seen it engraved at the top of a peddler's ballad, and took away my appetite for courts of justice. I'll chance it, Alan, said I. I'll go with you. But mind you, said Alan, it's no small thing. You maun lie bare and hard and brook many an empty belly. Your beds shall be the moorcocks, and your life shall be like the hunted deers, and you shall sleep with your hand upon your weapons. Ay, man, you shall taigle many a weary foot, or we get clear. I tell you this at the start, for it's a life that I can well. But if you ask what other chance you have, I answer, nane. Either take to the heather with me, or else hang. And that's a choice very easily made, said I, and we shook hands upon it. And now let's take another keek at the redcoats, said Allan, and he led me to the northeastern fringe of the wood. Looking out between the trees, we could see a great sight of mountain, running down exceeding steep into the waters of the loch. It was a rough part, all hanging stone and heather, and bit scrogs of birchwood. And away at the far end, toward Ballachulish, little wee red soldiers were dipping up and down over hill and howe and growing smaller every minute. There was no cheering now, for I think they had other uses for what breath was left them, but they still stuck to the trail, and doubtless thought that we were close in front of them. Allan watched them, smiling to himself. "Aye," said he, "they'll be gay weary before they've got to the end of that employ. And so you and me, David, can sit down and eat a bite, and breathe a bit longer, and take a dram from my bottle. Then we'll strike for Oakherne, the house of my kinsman James of the Glens, where I must get my clothes and my arms and money to carry us along. And then, David, we'll cry forth fortune and take a cast among the heather." So we sat again, and ate and drank in a place where we could see the sun going down into a field of great, wild, and houseless mountains, such as I was now condemned to wander in with my companion. Partly as we so sat, and partly afterwards on the way to Oakherne, each of us narrated his adventures, and I shall here set down so much of Allan's as seems either curious or needful. It appears he ran to the bulwarks as soon as the wave was past, saw me, and lost me, and saw me again, as I tumbled in the roost, and at last had one glimpse of me clinging on the yard. It was this that put him in some hope I would maybe get to land after all, and made him leave those clues and messages which had brought me, for my sins, to that unlucky country of Appin. In the meanwhile, those still on the brig had got the skiff launched, and one or two were on board of her already, when there came a second wave greater than the first, and heaved the brig out of her place, and would certainly have sent her to the bottom had she not struck and caught on some projection of the reef. When she had struck first, it had been bow's end, so that the stern had hitherto been lowest. But now her stern was thrown in the air, and the bows plunged under the sea. And with that, the water began to pour into the forescuttle like the pouring of a mill dam. It took the color out of Allan's face even to tell what followed, for there were still two men lying impotent in their bunks, and these, seeing the water pour in and thinking the ship had foundered, began to cry out aloud, and that with such harrowing cries that all who were on deck tumbled one after another into the skiff and fell to their oars. They were not 200 yards away when there came a third great sea, and at that the brig lifted clean over the reef. Her canvas filled for a moment, and she seemed to sail in chase of them, but settling all the while. And presently she drew down and down as if a hand was drawing her, and the sea closed over the Covenant of Dysart. Never a word they spoke as they pulled ashore, being stunned with the horror of that screaming. But they had scarce set foot upon the beach when Hosiason woke up as if out of a muse, and bade them lay hands upon Allan. They hung back indeed, having little taste for the employment, but Hosiason was like a fiend, crying that Allan was alone, that he had a great sum about him, that he had been the means of losing the brig and drowning all their comrades, and that here was both revenge and wealth upon a single cast. It was 7 against 1. In that part of the shore there was no rock that Allan could set his back to, and the sailors began to spread out and come behind him. And then, said Allan, the little man with the red head, I have no mind of the name that he is called. Rioch, said I. Aye, said Allan, Rioch. Well, it was him that took up the clubs for me, asked the men if they weren't afeard of a judgment, and says he, Dod, I'll put my back to the Highlandmans myself. That's none such an entirely bad little man, yon little man with the red head, said Allan. He has some spunks of decency. Well, said I, he was kind to me in his way. And so he was to Allan, said he, and by my troth I found his way a very good one. But you see, David, the loss of the ship and the cries of these poor lads sat very ill upon the man, and I'm thinking that would be the cause of it. Well, I would think so, says I, for he was as keen as any of the rest at the beginning. But how did Hosiason take it? It sticks in my mind that he would take it very ill, says Allan. But the little man cried to me to run, and indeed I thought it was a good observe and ran. The last that I saw, they were all in a knot upon the beach, like folk that were not agreeing very well together." "What do you mean by that?" said I. "Well, the fists were going," said Allan, "and I saw one man go down like a pair of breeks. But I thought it would be better no to wait. You see, there's a strip of Campbell's in that end of Mull, which is no good company for a gentleman like me. If it hadn't have been for that, I would have waited and looked for you myself, let alone giving a hand to the little man." It was droll how Allan dwelt on Mr. Rioch's stature, for, to say the truth, the one was not much smaller than the other. "So," says he, continuing, "I set my best foot forward, and whenever I met in with any one I cried out there was a wreck ashore. Man, they didna stop to fash with me. You should have seen them linking for the beach. And when they got there they found they had had the pleasure of a run, which is aye good for a Campbell. I'm thinking it was a judgment on the clan that the brig went down in the lump and didna break. But it was a very unlucky thing for you, that same, for if any wreck had come ashore they would have hunted high and low and would soon have found you." We'll stop there today, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.